But now I'm going to ask us to, maybe some of you want to close your eyes, but I want to ask Isabelle to take us away from this green and verdant land and transport us to the Eastern Cape and to your home where your parents set up in 1997, a very special area that you are doing amazing conservation work in, and I want you to take us there, describe it, describe the landscape, describe the journey of your parents and how you've become involved in this incredible project, and then we'll bring it back to here and see how they connect.
Sure, absolutely. So Samara Karoo Reserve started about 27 years ago, and really my parents fell in love with the land, not really with each other, that happened a little bit earlier, but my mum is South African, my father is British, and after 1994, the first democratic elections in South Africa, I think my mum felt a connection to her homeland and wanted to become invested in it and actually, spend more time there. And they went to the battlefields up in KwaZulu-Natal, the site of the Anglo-Zulu War, so the Anglo-Boer War. There's a few skirmishes there too. And some of you may have heard of David Rattray, the late David Rattray, and he would give these talks and talk about the tragedy and the triumph and sort of really the death and the life and all of that, and it was all rather moving. And as one does, you sit around a table and speak politely to the person on your left, and then turn and speak politely to the person on your right. And it just so happened the person on my mother's right was a man from a different part of South Africa known as the Great Karoo. It also happened that he was an estate agent, and he had a farm for sale. And these things happen. So, and he wove this story about the Karoo. And my mother, having grown up in Johannesburg and driven down to the coast, so near Cape Town and Plettenberg Bay, every holiday, knew of the Karoo, but it was really a place you drove through to get from A to B. It wasn't a place you stopped. It wasn't a place you spent much time. And so she thought, oh, the Karoo, there's nothing there. And he wove these tales of this estate agent wove these tales of what had been in the Karoo, and it turns out that it actually was one of the great wildlife areas of Africa. Even South Africans don't know about it, really, and don't know that that was the case. Long story short, they fell in love with this idea of actually recreating something really wild and something special in that region, which had now been turned over to agriculture. And a few months later, with me in tow, I was 5 at the time, and I had a little sister as well, a bit younger than me. We went along and essentially we drove off the beaten track, arrived in this landscape and essentially fell in love with it. And I think that's really where the whole thing started. It started from a place of love, and then a place of slight folly as well, then realizing the task we'd actually taken on to take this land, which it totals 27,000 hectares, so it's a very large piece of land, consisting of mountains, valleys, rivers. The topography is incredibly varied. There are 5 of South Africa's 9 vegetation biomes on the reserve, so it's sort of a microcosm really of the bigger country. People often say South Africa is the world in one country, and so we have all of that diversity. And really the aim was to rewild it and bring it back to what it once was. And I think the thing with rewilding is that you can't ever recreate necessarily what happened 200, 300, 400 years ago. The context has changed. And what had happened 300 years ago was what is said to have been the largest land-based migration in Africa, which was the Springbok migration. And we certainly don't believe that we would necessarily in my lifetime or my children's lifetime be able to recreate that migration. But really what it's about is putting back the pieces of the ecological puzzle, restoring the component parts of the landscape, introducing lions again, introducing cheetahs, elephants, black rhinoceros, the first in over a century, the first in almost 2 centuries in some cases, and essentially bring that landscape back to life, really, from what it had been, which was desiccated and all the indigenous wildlife had been removed. So when you sit at Samara now and you close your eyes, you don't necessarily hear the same birds. Well, you may hear some of the same birds actually, we'll get to that in a minute, that you would hear here. But it's that feeling of space. I think that's one of the big draw cards for me, certainly. And the knowledge also that we're a story of hope. I think that's quite special to know that in a world where there's so much doom and gloom and everybody is talking about the extinction crisis and climate change and all of this, to have a little pocket of the earth where we're restoring and we're regenerating and recreating something is really quite special.
We'll come on to some of those individual initiatives in a minute, but let's hop over back to where we are now and hear what the landscape holds right outside and what special areas of interest there are right here outside these doors.
Yeah, so it's the perfect time of year to be coming to Thyme and experiencing the landscape out here. So as Karen said, we've been studying the bird life here in Southwark for over 5 years now, so we've got a good baseline of what's out there. And one of the methods we use for that is bird ringing, which Karen mentioned. And if you don't know, that's where we put a fine mist net up in the between the bushes and trees, and we catch the birds. And that allows us to study them, to identify them, to look at the age and sex of the species we're catching, which gives us a much better understanding of the demography, the numbers of adult birds, how they're breeding, how successful they are each year, how often they return back to Southwark each spring. And one of the brilliant things about this site is the diversity of different species we get out there in the water meadows and the hedgerows and the willows along the river. And so over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been recording each spring the returning birds to this part of Gloucestershire, and seeing that actually there's a huge diversity of warblers. So these are sub-Saharan migrants that are spending the winter months in usually West Africa. A few of them go down as far as South Africa, and they're coming back here in the spring to breed. And the reason they do that is because of the abundance of insect life for them to feed on and feed their chicks on, but also the long days, which means they can feed over a much longer period than they would do in the more equatorial regions. So this diversity has been allowed to flourish with current management of the site and the way that hedgerows are left to grow wild, and you can farm a little bit in between that, but also it's a bit of a migrant magnet, because they can see this huge pristine piece of landscape, and they'll come and capitalise on that and come back and use it. So it's been a real privilege to come and measure that and see how that's changed over the last few years as well. So things like having wider margins where we do hay mow and leave space for the hedges to grow up and get more extensive. We've looked at the ways that the water flows around the meadows with the wetlands that have been created there, and that's attracted in other species of wetland-loving species like waders. So we see green sandpipers, which are a small wading bird that come through. So they don't usually stay for long, but they'll use this site to feed up and find food that they need for the next leg of their journey further north into the UK, or in the autumn further back into West Africa. So the research here has been really interesting, and all that feeds into an overall national picture of wildlife, which is overseen by the British Trust for Ornithology. So we feed all our data back to them, and they can then build up a national picture of what's happening with breeding seasons in the face of habitat change and climate effects, extreme weather, that sort of thing. So there's lots of factors that are influencing these birds, and that's why these sites are so important, because in the farm landscape with house building and lots of other pressures around, these sites have become really important. So having them within the farm landscape, so you can have productive farms with more natural areas in between, and they're connected by hedgerows and woodlands, is something we're advocating. So as part of this work, we have a project called West Oxfordshire Farmland Bird Project. So we work with farmers and landowners to improve their sites for farmland birds in general, but that includes lots of these migrants that come over from Africa in the spring and summer.
Thank you, that's fabulous. Let's join these two places now. Let's get on the back of that. I think it's particularly the willow warbler that we might see out in the meadows, fingers crossed, or we might hear. If you can, sing their bird song, maybe.
I can't. They've got a really distinct song. It's like a sort of descending scale of notes, and it rises above a lot of the other birds on it.
Perfect. Well, let's now. Can you take us on that flight path, direct from the reserve? Where are these birds going? How long does it take them? how do they feed? How do they eat? What are they looking for when they get here? And let's go on that journey together.
So yeah, there are a few species of these warblers that are actually making huge journeys back down to southern Africa, including the Karoo. And one of those is the willow warbler, which is a small yellow-green warbler, and they typically weigh about 8 grams. So this is about as much as a 50-pence piece, and they're making journeys across the Sahara in one hop, and then feeding up. And their research over the last few years has shown they sort of ride a green wave of vegetation across Africa on that journey. So they'll follow the rains and use that a bit like the springbok migration and mammal migration in East Africa and South Africa, where they'll use up the resources available to them. And what's interesting is these tiny birds are making these huge distant journeys across Southern Africa, and then making a leap across the Sahara Desert, which is often the most challenging step of their journey, up through Southern Europe in the spring, and they're arriving back in the UK and breeding sites in about mid-April usually. So they leave their sites in Southern Africa in January, February, and take a couple of months to get all the way north. And it's a quite incredible journey of 7,000.
Where do they rest? Do they sleep on the wing? Or what?
No, so it's quite an extreme exertive effort they put in, so that they'll migrate at night, which is a mechanism to avoid predation from hawks and other predators during the day, and then they use days to feed up. So there's not much time for sleeping on their migration journeys, and they're evolved to withstand that. They won't sleep basically. They'll feed up at sites during the day, and then fly over all night, and they'll build up fat reserves to make long distance.
So they have a massive sleep in here.
Well, that's the challenge, because as soon as they arrive here, they've got to start breeding. So the males can't afford to rest. They've got to start singing their hearts out and attracting a mate. So again, there's no little time for that. They do have a rest period in their life cycles after the breeding season, sort of August, September in the northern hemisphere here, where they change their feathers, so they moult all their feathers in sites like South Africa. So the other we see here is an autumn migration, which is the southwards migration through places like this, where we see species that are not just breeding here, but things that are coming from further north, and that's when we see most diversity in the water meadows here, is in August and September, where you're seeing a lot of things passing back through on their way back down to South Africa.
Are those birds, or which species of those birds are coming, like I think swifts and swallows, don't they go right back to the same nest? Is that the same for the warblers, or how do we know when these birds are arriving, and what signs are we looking for if we're looking at our terrain? What would tell us that they're coming?
So one of the brilliant aspects about ringing is that we put an ID ring on their leg, so we can see these birds coming back to the same sites again. So we know it's the same bird coming back and singing in that tree. And it shows the importance of that site, because they're then faithful to that site. Once they become adults and they're in breeding condition, they'll return to the same places, often to the same bushes. So it means that conserving those sort of habitats is vitally important, because if you turn up after a long journey from Southern Africa and then find out that bush is gone, or it's been turned into a housing estate, then that is hugely challenging for that bird. It's got to then exert resource trying to find somewhere else. So yeah, that's a challenge. And typically, most of the migrant birds that we see coming from Africa will be faithful to their site. So you can usually assume that the swifts flying around the village are the ones that are used to coming back to Southern Europe here, or they're coming back to the same breeding sites. There are a few things that are a little bit less exact about where they come back to, but on the whole, they'll be very faithful to their breeding sites.
And these birds in the Karoo, what role do they play in the ecosystem? What are they up to with you?
Well, I mean, every bird has obviously got a niche that it fulfills. In terms of the willow warblers, you're probably better placed to say than I am.
So in Southern Africa, they're in woodland in general, so in fynbos and where you've got sort of sparse woodland in general. So lots of places where there are abundance of insects. In general, they'll go to wetter places where either it's just rained or they're in river valleys and things like that in Southern Africa.
And it's really interesting, funny enough, with the rewilding work that we've done, we've actually seen a lot more species come back that we didn't necessarily have previously. So there's a particular bird, it's not a bird that migrates up into this area, but it's called the white-browed sparrow weaver. And we are actually the southwesternmost extent of that bird. So if you look at a sort of distribution map, there's this little dot, and that's essentially where we are. And the reason that we've actually had a lot more of these birds, they use grasses to build their nests. And with the rewilding that we've done, a lot more grass is left standing later into the season, which enables them to then actually build their nest. So it's small things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, and again that interconnectedness, as you were saying, of when they come back to the same spot. I mean, it just makes you realise that the thread that kind of runs through not just an ecosystem or a country, but actually on a global scale.
For sure.
It's quite incredible.
Every story inevitably has to have a sad element. I'm guessing these migratory routes are challenged and a threat. We all know what we're creating with our fossil fuel burning and pollution and overcrowded airspace, etc. What are the major challenges you're seeing, and what is being done to mitigate them? And is there ideally hope that these creatures can continue to do what they should be doing?
These migrants obviously face huge challenges on their journeys, and with a lot of the biodiversity monitoring here in the UK of birds in particular, it's these migrants, long distance migrants, that are being affected most and declining most. And so over the last 70 years, we've seen a massive decline in a lot of these migrant birds, and that's due to multiple factors, unfortunately, as you say. Climate change as a result of fossil fuel burning is obviously a huge impact on these, because they turn up at the site expecting to find food there, and it's dry or it's been too wet and flooded out, and they can't find that resource that they would have relied on. And extreme weather events also. There's been a wet season in Spain, which is, people may have noticed the delay in swifts and swallows turning up this year, and maybe fewer numbers than the previous years, and that's due to these extreme weather events in the southern part of Europe.
And habitat loss, isn't it?
Exactly, and that happens all the way along and why rewilding projects are so important, because they act as these reserves for things to move in. And one of the most optimistic things is that actually that if you create a site, you rewild somewhere that's been depleted in its biodiversity, it doesn't take very long for nature to move back in. And that's one of the brilliant things, is that you can make a small change, or you can change the land use slightly, and immediately nature and wildlife will jump back into that niche.
Absolutely.
And you've probably seen that with
We have actually, and funny enough, with the bird species, so the Cape vulture has started coming back to our region, because obviously they're scavengers, and so they scavenge from carcasses, and before there were predators back in our area, there were no real carcasses to speak of. The farmers would clear, if a sheep were to die, they'd clear it because they don't want the spread of disease. But now that we've had cheetahs for about 20 odd years, and we've had lion now for about 6 years, I think it is, we're starting to have a lot more carcasses lying around, which means the vultures are coming back. And the Cape vulture in particular is highly endangered. And what's interesting actually, again with the bird tagging, there's a lot of vulture conservation initiatives within South Africa, and they tag the birds. And the one bird that we saw had travelled something like 700 kilometres from its nesting and roosting site all the way to our region to feed and then to move on. And what's rather nice when you look at sort of a project like ours, all the old farm names tell you a story about what used to be there and has since been extinguished. And the one mountain is called Arskelberg, which means Vulture Mountain, and it's got these very iconic sort of cliffs up at the top, which is where they would have roosted. So hopefully one day we'll see them back more permanently, because at the moment they come and they sort of scan and they'll settle, and maybe they'll be there for a few weeks, but eventually they'll leave again, because there's not really enough carrying within the wider landscape. Because even though we're 27,000 hectares, which is larger than 30% of South Africa's national parks, it's still, in the grand scheme of things, it's still a very small piece of land, actually.
But you have an ambition to create 3 million acres,
3 million acres,
don't you?
Absolutely, yes.
Where are you up to?
Oh gosh. It's very much a long-term project. But so yes, our vision really, and Samara is quite different in the sense that when my parents started, I say we, I mean I was 5, so, but I certainly agree with their philosophy in terms of what they did, was not just to start a safari destination and a commercial lodge, etc., but actually to start with the science. So to start by saying, what is this land? What is this land? What are the ecosystem processes? What is the potential for the biodiversity upon the land? And so, as I said, you know, we've ended up with a landscape that is incredibly diverse. Sorry, where am I going with that? What was it? Oh yes, the big
footprint, 3 million.
Exactly. So by taking things a scientific way first, we've obviously had to engage with a lot of ecologists, a lot of conservationists who are active in these spaces. And it's not really our idea, but you know, the idea that the sandparks scientists have come up with is to link together 3 of their national parks. The one is about 18 kilometers from our border to the west, the other is probably a similar distance to the east, and then the third is the Addo Elephant National Park near Port Elizabeth, which some of you may know, which is about an hour away as a crow flies. And really, Samara is viewed as the most important stepping stone in terms of linking those together. And that will create a 3 million acre landscape. And what's really exciting about that is the current scientific modelling is showing that within part of that landscape, so not even the full 3 million acres, but part of that landscape, we'd be able to sustain functional populations of, I think it's something like 12 different ungulate species. So a functional population, I mean, you'll know better than I do, I'm not trained in this, but from what I understand, we have a problem with small reserves and small conservation projects, because what tends to happen is that they're not big enough for actual species to sustain themselves in the long term. They're too small, you can't have natural migrations between these populations, you have to have human-assisted migrations, like essentially what we did when we brought the animals on, we had to translocate them from other places. And the long and the short of it is that despite the proliferation of protected areas, species continue to decline, whether it be lion, whether it be cheetah. Still, you know, you're seeing either the population is sort of stable or it's declining, and we're not increasing as we should. And what's really exciting about this project is that we would have a critical mass of at least 10,000 individuals, which is what you need for these species in order to actually maintain up those population processes which enable them to persist into the future. And that includes 3 species that are found only in South Africa. So the Cape Mountain zebra, the black wildebeest, and the blesbok, which all exist on Samara as well. And you also then have very significant populations of cheetah and of black rhino. So really, it just shows you how important scale is. You know, acting in isolation within Samara's borders is all very well, but if we really want to have a true impact, and for it to be an eco project and not just an ego project, it's got to have a wider impact.
Let's hone down on both of you. I know you touched on a bit of, you know, leaving hedgerows and leaving wider borders, but rewilding is, you know, it's a trendy term. It's in the press. What does it mean in both of these contexts? How are you rewilding your landscape? What is the process by which you are doing that? Is it less is more or more is less?
It's a very good question. Rewilding, I think, is perhaps more controversial in this context, in this country. In South Africa, we still have all of our mega herbivores and big megafauna. So we haven't lost lions yet. You know, we've got leopards, we've got elephants and rhinos, even though they weren't necessarily in our region, because that had been converted to farmland. They were available within, you know, the country for us to translocate back into the region. Whereas here, obviously, a lot of the megafauna is no longer around; it's totally extinct. But from our perspective, rewilding, and it's particularly trophic rewilding, so those trophic cascades, it's all about the ecosystem function. So when we introduced lions in 2019, it wasn't just to provide habitat for lions, which is a declining species. It was also to restore the function of predation, which is what happens obviously when, you know, lions are self-sustaining and they feed for themselves, they're still herbivores. And what's really interesting is the science shows that it's not only the predation effect, but the very presence of lions on a landscape changes the way in which the herbivores use that landscape. And they actually call it the landscape of fear, because these animals now know there's a predator out there, so there's that fear, and they use the vegetation differently. It affects their fertility as well. So all these things that you wouldn't necessarily think about, and for us, rewilding is really putting the component pieces of that ecological puzzle all back together, so that we can have a landscape that A, is as self-sustaining as possible, so requires the least amount of management, and B, is resilient in the face of the challenges that are going to come our way, whether it be drought, whether it be floods, whether it be the broader context of climate change, all of those sorts of things.
You're right in saying that you have these beasts. We have completely got rid of any of our keystone species. The beaver is gradually coming back, and there are Ben Goldsmith, for example, a huge advocate of bringing back the lynx and the bear, the wolf, which obviously used to prowl these lands a long time ago. Obviously, we're quite a populated country now. What is your view of that? And then what are you doing here to really kind of turbo boost your biodiversity for flora and fauna?
Yeah, so with rewilding, it's always a question of scale. In South Africa, and all those large animals which are available to be translocated or moved back in naturally. Here in the UK, it's slightly more challenging. There are pilot projects, but also there's a lot of resistance to some of these beaver reintroductions and ideas about reintroducing lynx and other predators into the landscape because of the farm landscape and the fact that they've been absent for such a long period as well. So whether the natural landscape here in the UK can support a population of larger mammals is challenging. So there are smaller rewilding projects going on at NEP in Sussex where they've been able to do a lot of work on ecosystem function and improving the habitat, which is in general for birds and insects, which has been successful. And again, it's not a huge area of landscape, but shows what you can do if you let nature take its course and don't have too much input from human management. And on the scale here in Southwark, again, you can rewild a hedgerow. You can let it grow out. You can give a whole range of different sward heights in your meadow, as we do here with the mowing regimes and things like that, which produces that diversity, and that's what in general is picked on by the migrant birds and insects that are coming here. So again, it's not going to be the fauna of Southern Africa, but on a smaller scale, you can make something that's attractive to wildlife and really productive for things that are going to turn up.
In your 5 years that you've been tagging birds, etc., what are you seeing, up or down?
In general, it's very stable, so which is a good thing because lots of farmland sites are losing their breeding birds at a high rate. So if we can stabilise some of these things, there's been a few successes. So there's a species called the lesser white-throat, which is a small warbler, which has got a rather unusual migration because rather than going from the UK down into Spain and Iberia and then to West Africa, this species moves eastwards through Europe and then down through the Middle East into Eastern Africa, and they'll generally spend the winter in Sudan and Ethiopia. And that species here has benefited from the hedgerows. They're not a wetland species in general, but they'll benefit from wild hedgerows with lots of fruit on them left through the winter so they can feed well into the autumn. So before they migrate, so they'll spend the autumn here and then take this long route through Eastern Europe and down into Eastern Africa that way. So that's something that's increased in number here. So there have been small numbers of increases that we've seen over those 5 years. And in general, the habitat here is producing large, high numbers of birds. So not just for migrants from Africa, but also the resident birds. The 2 weeks ago I was here, and the number of song thrushes and blackbirds here in those hedgerows was quite incredible. And I had some visitors from Suffolk who joined me for the morning, and they were impressed about how just the resident birds, the things we think is common, but actually are proliferating really successfully here. So that's something that's improved over the last 5 years.
You were recommending an amazing bird song app called Merlin.
Merlin, yes.
So maybe we can all download that.
From Cornell University, and it will identify birds with that song. It's brilliant. If you don't know.
Do you know if it works worldwide? I'm just thinking.
I think it
does.
does.
Also here.
Yes, it does.
It does. Yeah, brilliant. We'll close up in a little bit, but I think it's always really nice to leave people with ideas of what we can be doing, whether I have, my pot plant at home or my, I don't have acres to look after, but each one of us has different abilities to do stuff with the environment we are in. What are your top easy wins or difficult wins? What like I'm doing no mow May. That's hopefully a good thing. But is come 1st of June, am I like killing all the insects or what?
I'm going to say something about no
Go
mow
on.
May. I was really traumatised last year by no mow May because as we then started to cut the grass, we began to sort of, well, you've got little nesting things in it that you actually chop up. So the only thing I think you need to do is walk through with a stick before you do it, and if you see a little dormouse nesting in there.
You don't hear a motor going down.
We had a little nest of baby hedgehogs, and it was all very traumatic.
Oh my goodness.
So I think we've got to be just careful about it, because almost mowing it too soon.
It's like no mow.
Just like
You
no mow or no, I think is
Yeah, you can
better.
leave it until September.
I think
if
mowing
that's
it
a possibility.
is
And it's about
do.
having diversity as well.
I
You
think
can
we're
mow-
better just leaving it.
So it's a bad campaign.
Well, I think it's a flawed campaign, really.
Well,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was
I
going
was
to say,
gonna raise it.
it's a really interesting example about why ecologists and taxonomists are so important, and the science is so important. Because we all went into no mow May thinking about pollinators.
Yeah.
But if I understood the science that came out a couple of weeks ago, really what they're asking us all to do is to think about the habitats all the year round. So, I mean, as I walk back in, I've been lucky enough to see what's been going on here for 5+ years. I was so excited to see that actually some of it, in old eyes, looks scruffy. The habitats are fantastic. There's more grass and small habitats, and you've created pathways through some of the areas that were much more controlled
Yeah.
and clipped before. So it's providing those habitats. So to answer your question, plant in the window boxes that are bee friendly, or to attract those and see what works and what you enjoy seeing.
Yeah.
And you'll be surprised, because if the insects come, then the birds will probably come, and whether it's the robins or the blackbirds or the more common birds, or you suddenly get surprised that you've got a wren tootling around in your leaves because you didn't actually pick them up.
I blame Capability Brown. I mean, all these laws. I have a fantasy that we should kind of, all those huge, amazing pictures of estates with beautifully mown, parterre lawns. Actually, if we put in the public space rewilded, we would kind of change our perception of what the English landscape and beauty means. And something with quite wild with scruffy, like you say, but actually that's the beautiful
But I
bit.
think thinking about the landscape throughout the whole year rather than just May is important, because I think leaving it long and then cutting it is problematic for small mammals.
I would also add, just on that point, it's interesting because I think we as human beings, we assume that the landscape should be kind of in our image. So as you say, it should be beautiful and aesthetic, and we want a mowed lawn because we can walk on it and picnic on it. And something that we found, nature always does things differently to how you expect. In our landscape, we didn't have elephants for almost 200 years. And we had these beautiful tall trees, and you'll see the logo of Samara is two cheetahs with a beautiful shepherd tree in the middle. And what elephants do is knock down trees. That's, they feed on trees, they strengthen their muscles on trees, and so immediately people said to us, your logo is not going to make sense anymore. Elephants, why are you bringing elephants back? They're going to knock down all the trees. But really, what we had gotten used to was an absence of elephants on the landscape. So these beautiful tall trees reflect a lack of something, actually. And what we found that's really, really interesting is the elephants have been knocking, luckily not the logo trees, so that's all right, but other species of tree, they've been knocking them down, but the trees are not dying. They're coppicing, and they're actually taking a different form, and so they're maybe becoming more bush-like rather than tree-like. And obviously the typical trees, you see in the Serengeti, it's the browse line that obviously makes them look like umbrellas. So really, I suppose it's those interesting sort of, our relationship with nature is governed a lot by what we deem to be pretty, but it's not necessarily what's the most biodiverse. Because in changing the shape of that tree, now a smaller antelope can actually access it to browse, rather than when it was out there and they couldn't reach it. So all these interesting things when you're kind of living these projects, you have to sort of question yourself as well and your own ideals and what it means, you know, to have a beautiful landscape.
Oh, for sure. So, sorry, coming back to you, what should we
Obviously,
do?
you can do things on any scale, and with all these migrant birds coming from Africa, they're insectivorous, so anything that can produce good habitat for insects, and then the pollinators can feed on flowering plants and things like that. So we need to have that in our landscape, but you can do that on small scales and improve the chances of migrant birds populating an area, so they'll need that. And as Karen says, you want to have a diversity in the landscape, so you can mow bits, you can have beautiful landscapes with mown and unmown areas that do maybe look a bit unscruffy, but keep that mixture of habitat, and that will produce the most diverse wildlife you can achieve as well.
Super. How can we, you know, if we're interested in what you're doing, how can we support you? What I know you run an eco lodge, and I know Venetia's going to talk about a trip out there with Journeys with Purpose in a second. But anyone who's interested, how can we find out more about what you're up to?
So hopefully a few of you've got some of our brochures in front of you. And yeah, so Samara has 3 lodges on our property. We're funded through responsible tourism. Basically, our rewilding projects are funded through tourism. For the most part, we have a small regenerative agriculture component, which my husband Dirk in the corner there is now running. So we do farm to fork as well. And really, yes, we accept guests and visitors to come and stay with us. And Journeys with Purpose is organising a trip in November to come up, I think it's 6 nights, and essentially meet the people behind the scenes. So myself, my mother, the ecologists that we work with. We have some really exciting scientific research going on the reserve. We also have, in terms of our bigger vision of trying to link together these national parks, there's also a lot of interesting work happening there. And I think in general, really, you know, looking at when going on holiday, you know, what can we, you know, what can people do? It's looking to pick responsible kind of tourism outfitters, the kind of the tour operators and the destinations that are actually walking the talk. Because I think there is a lot of greenwashing that goes on, and so asking the right questions, you know, not being afraid to sort of say, well, is this really what you do, you know, and questioning the so-called seals of credibility that properties may have. One of the things that we do is we're part of something called the Long Run, which is a collection of nature-based tourism businesses. Journeys with Purpose is also part of the Long Run, an affiliate member, and really the reason for being part of something like that is to guide us on our sustainability journey, because when we started 27 years ago, the word rewilding didn't really exist. The word sort of regenerative tourism didn't really exist either. But we've embodied those values, I think, throughout our journey, and becoming part of the Long Run is a way of actually formalising that into our operations. And it's very much a journey. You know, it's an ongoing story and situation, and nobody's perfect. But I think having those aspirations and having an action plan to get to that point is really the seal of, and the mark of, you know, truly sustainable company. So that's what we do.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I hope there's some questions now before we go for a walk.
Izzy, can I just ask, what do you see? I know you've really introduced lots of different species. What do you see as sort of your biggest success?
It's a very good question. To be honest, it's actually a species we haven't reintroduced. We started seeing leopards coming back again. And leopards, in South Africa, by the nature of our context, is that there are sheep farms and cattle farms around, so we have to have fences around the property to keep the animals in. And leopards don't care about fences, so you know they will hop over quite easily, find a tree to climb over. And the fact that they've come back, only really since we introduced lions actually, which is quite interesting. So since 2019 we've had a lot more leopard sightings. We see leopard tracks, we have a camera trap sort of project where he takes a photograph when triggered by movement. And I think that to me is really, it's the things that we haven't physically translocated that are actually coming back of their own accord, the vulture as well. There's a little creature called a black-footed cat, which is said to be the most ferocious animal. I think they have like a 70% success rate when they hunt, so they're really quite amazing little cats. And they're quite vulnerable as well, and they've started coming back. So really, for me, it's the slightly intangible things of when you put the pieces back, a lot of the other stuff starts falling into place without you needing to do it. And I think that's really the whole point about rewilding as well, is that if you let nature do its thing, it will come back, you know, and flourish.
And how do you maintain that balance between, you know, you spoke about local farmers and, you know, with their sheep and things, obviously that could potentially be quite difficult, you know. Could you tell me a bit about that?
So it was very difficult at the beginning. We had a lot of opposition. You know, people said to my parents, well, my great-grandfather shot out the last cheetah. Why on earth are you bringing them back? What's the point? And I think there's a disconnect. It's a shifting baseline syndrome of, if you've grown up in a landscape devoid of wildlife, you don't know anything better, and you assume that bringing them back is now the problem. And I think that it happens to all of us. I mean, we all feel that way, particularly in this country. I mean, the idea of bringing back wolves and lynx, it's scary. But so, well, actually, my mum refers to my husband Dirk as our secret weapon, because Dirk is South African. He's Afrikaans from the area, well, from the broader area. And we've actually started our own farming project, but a regenerative farming project. So really looking at using the cattle and sheep as a tool to manage the land and to restore the land. And in that way, we now, rather than being outsiders who are bringing on lions and elephants and all these crazy things, we've become insiders who understand what the farming community is going through. And we've also realized, having been on the landscape for a quarter of a century, that if we're to achieve these big corridors, we actually need to work with the farmers, not against them. And we need to find ways to incorporate the farming culture, because it is very much a farming area, into a conservation estate as well. And so one of the things we're looking at, and there are examples of it elsewhere in Africa, in Kenya in particular, also in Zambia, of actually farming that takes place within areas with wildlife. But it can be done in certain ways that actually help to restore the land as well. So that's one of the projects we're working on at the moment, and I think that'll actually be the key to ensuring that we create those bigger wildlife corridors.
Yeah, coexistence.
Coexistence. Well, we're a part of the ecosystem. We tend to forget that, but we're just a very successful species.
Karen,
Yes, I had a question just about planting with plant species and things. Have you done much planting, or?
We have done a certain amount. So the landscape is very varied. So in some areas, tree planting would be appropriate, like in the grassland areas. So we've had different approaches to the different vegetation biomes. One of the areas where we have planted is in the thicket areas, which were very thick bush, very thick vegetation, which were very badly degraded by goat farming. So you have sort of 2 or 3 meters of topsoil that's been eroded away, and you can still see that even 27 years later, because the land, it takes, you know, minutes to sort of do the damage, but then it takes decades or even centuries to restore what's been lost. And there we plant speckbull, which is a really interesting plant, yes, as we were talking about. It's a succulent that has its genetic origins in tropical rainforest, but it's endemic to our region, which is a semi-arid region. And it's very highly absorbent of carbon dioxide, and it also binds the soil. And the roots of some of those plants that are still there are hundreds of years old. So they're really, and again, from a carbon capture perspective, they store the carbon within the roots. So it's a really important plant. So we do plant those in the correct areas.
Any more?
I've got a question for Olly. If the insects are important to the birds coming to the water meadows here, do you monitor those as well, or do you just hope that they're
Not
going to
here.
look after themselves?
But there are projects around lowland Britain that do monitor the diet of the birds that we're catching. So there's lots of new DNA-based techniques now to look at the diet of birds through their feces. So it's more of a research area with migrants on their wintering grounds, where we do research in West Africa to see what they're eating as part of that movement through different latitudes as they come back north, because different fruit trees all ripen at different times. So diet on the migration is monitored a lot more these days. But here there are small studies, and it generally species specific. So if there's a farmland bird or a species that's declining faster, then there'll be a specific research project on that. And there are, at the moment this year, looking at corn buntings, which is not a species we get here, but around on the local arable farms, particularly where there are wide field margins, and that we're looking at the diet of those this year. So it's generally more targeted research on the diet and the insects that these species are eating.
What do the warblers eat?
A mixture of flies and midges in general. They'll eat caterpillars, so usually they're timed to arrive back on breeding grounds as caterpillars are emerging and eating the newly emerged leaves on oak trees and other species. So in general, yeah, it's that the small insects, caterpillars and flies, which there are abundance of here in the watermeadows.
Because you have a research project in Africa as well, don't you?
Yeah, so I spend a few months of the year in the Gambia and Senegal looking at migrant birds on the wintering grounds, because yes, it's all well and good having good habitat here in the breeding season, but also we need to make sure that wintering habitat, where they're actually spending more of the year, so they spend more months in West Africa. So habitat change there is quite advanced, and the changes in farming there, particularly on the coastal regions where a lot of these birds are migrating. So UK breeding species are generally quite zonal to where they winter, and so a lot of the medium distance migrants that are going to West Africa will be on the coastal region of West Africa, and that's where habitat degradation is happening at the fastest. And so we do a lot of research there with the local wildlife departments and NGOs, looking at wintering areas and how that's changed over the last 20 years.
But one of the things that the BTO is doing is tagging cuckoos. So it's a fairly new technology that's allowed us to, actually see the migratory routes of the cuckoos, because up until probably 10 years ago, when this technology came up, we didn't have really any knowledge of where they went to. I think beyond one cuckoo that was ringed in Norfolk in early 1930 that was found dead in the Congo, and that is why we knew that cuckoos migrated, because of that one bird. But now if you look at the website of the BTO, you'll see the individual birds and their names and the routes they take. So there's a huge amount being learned about that.
Yeah, and so as technology gets more advanced and these devices get smaller, we're able to fit them onto smaller and smaller species. By sort of ethical agreement, you're not allowed to fit anything that's more than 3% of the mass of the bird. So some of these tiny birds, you can't fit any device that's going to record the position on. So as the technology gets smaller and these devices get into the size range that we can actually fit them into smaller species without monitoring migration of warblers and some of these tiny birds that are coming here in more detail. And the BTO are leading that science here in the UK, and we're learning about exactly where they're wintering in more detail, and that's useful for them pinpointing where they're facing threats from climate
We need
change.
a little camera, because the fact that our cuckoo might have been actually sitting with a gorilla in the Congo is quite an amazing thought, really.
Yeah, well, we know that these populations from across the UK of UK breeding cuckoos go down to the Congo Basin in the winter season, so these birds from Southwark will be going to that part of the world.
Do we know how they navigate these extraordinary distances with such accuracy to be able to come back to a tree they were nesting in?
Not completely, but it has to be genetic, because the cuckoo is a good example, because they're migrating at a different time than their adults, the parent birds. They stay around in the UK for a month longer and migrate to the Congo Basin and Central Africa by themselves, and so they must have a genetic inbuilt knowledge of how to get there. And there's a lot of science looking at that mechanism and how it's achieved in these birds, and so there's work on looking at the stars and using the star, because most of them will be nocturnal migrants, and they use the night sky to navigate to work out where north is and south, and there's various studies from researchers in Germany about how birds navigate using that sky. So they'll have an artificial night sky and be able to use that as a way of measuring the direction that birds take when they take a flight. They call it migratory restlessness, that they'll all congregate on one side of their keeping cage and then they'll be released the next morning. So they measure that direction. And another mechanism they have is they have an inbuilt compass, basically, which is due to their ear construction, has a tiny bit of metal iron fragment in it, and they can use that like a magnet to have nerves that then sense where that magnetic pull of the Earth's magnetic field is directing them. So it's quite a rudimentary mechanism, but it's actually effective at showing which way north and south is, and so they'll use that. And then once they've done the journey once, then they'll use known sites to migrate over. So that they'll use some ground-based imaging and views of what's happening on the ground. So they'll recognise sites and use those same places again. But they have to do that once by themselves or following other birds first. So there is an innate, inbuilt mechanism as well.
Fascinating. I think our time over. One more question.
Well, this is a huge question, really. and I'm just fascinated, incredibly curious that you set this up in post-apartheid South Africa. You know, a maelstrom. And I just wonder, how have you navigated, you know, with the government, with the whole community, with the wider political situation? I just am fascinated that you're talking with millions of acres. And I just can't quite get my head around it.
It's a good question. I think South Africa, for all its faults, has a very strong constitution, and actually the environment is quite strongly represented. And we have the body that looks after our national parks is called South African National Parks, and they're actually, believe it or not, world leaders in conservation. So they really are, they're doing good things, really good work. And remember also, South Africa is a signatory to all of these targets, you know, in terms of biodiversity, land under biodiversity, etc., 30 by 30, all of that. And so there is a need for them to work with the likes of private landowners like ourselves to actually collaborate and, you know, put land under conservation. And what we also do is, we were very clear that we needed to benefit society in a certain way. It's actually our shared heritage. The Karoo is a really special region. It's not particularly densely populated, but we have communities in our area, and we're very clear that particularly with the expansion of the landscape, there has to be a human element to it. It's sort of rewilding for people, you know, for want of a better expression. And I think, yeah, within the context in which we operate, people are critical. Without people having a vested interest in the success of a conservation initiative, it's doomed to failure, no matter how much money you might throw at it. And that's the other thing for us, is we believe strongly in the power of actually purpose-driven business, rather than it just being a charity case. It can't just be a philanthropic endeavour, because then the mood changes, people aren't interested in it any longer, the donor funding dries up. It's got to be a business, but a business that has a positive impact in those other spheres. Not sure if that really answers your question, but
could I just bring that question that you just answered home into the UK? Looking around here, it's a beautiful environment. There's opportunities for huge work to go on in this microstructure. Back in February, our government passed a law saying that biodiversity in this country will be minimised to 11% for landowners. So if you are a builder, a developer, you are required to make sure that only 11% of the work that you work with, and the land you work with, will be given over to biodiversity. English Nature were looking for, in that lobby, English Nature were looking for something like 25 to 28%, but they only got 11%. It's a very disappointing figure, and it worries me that, you know, in terms of biodiversity in this country and rewilding, that actually we seem to be being closed down rather than opened up. Yeah.
But I was going on a positive note, and I was going to ask Olly, and I know we all want to go out into nature, but are you involved, for example, in the North Cotswold farming cluster? Because just over the border here,
yep,
I can half answer the question that you can talk about it, but we have only the second project just literally over the county border in Oxfordshire to actually try and sell biodiversity net gain credits into the building industry. And one of the things about that legislation is that it has to be spent in the local authority. So if Witney expands its housing stock, the biodiversity offsets, the net gains, need to be done within Oxfordshire. And a very successful businessman has actually helped pay for the legal framework to make that possible, because he's been doing exactly what you've been doing in the Karoo here in Oxfordshire to create the first credit. It's not perfect and it is difficult, but I think the most scary thing is that with an election coming up, the building lobby in this country and the need for new low-cost housing is terrifying, and no one yet knows actually how to do it and how to measure net gain properly. I know there are metrics, but Olly, I mean, for example, I was really going from biodiversity credits to the collaboration at the landscape level between farming and what you call rewilding, and I would probably argue is regenerative.
Yeah, so there are regenerative farming methods which do all those things of improving the land for biodiversity, which you can incorporate into a farm landscape on all different scales. And then the biodiversity net gain input from developments around in the local area tends to be quite limited in its scope still, and that, yeah, the worry about having to meet housing requirements and a potential a target that then puts that front of stage rather than the actual biodiversity net gain that comes from that is a concern. So yeah, I think the farm clusters farmers working together, landowners working together is a force for yeah, but also for encouraging on a larger scale that sort of investment, because one farmer on their own can't necessarily make a big enough change in the landscape. So if there are quite a lot of farm clusters where groups work together and they're becoming more prevalent and supported by local wildlife trusts and other NGOs to try and link up those things, a bit like what you do with national parks on a slightly smaller scale, but actually linking places that are good for wildlife in the landscape. And BNG is the biodiversity net gain is part of that, but I think it's too limited in what you can achieve. So we've got a few projects locally that have we've tried to invest that money in something like a water meadow or farm wetlands and things like that. And actually, it will be effective on a small scale, but actually a more ambitious project is probably required to meet all those 35 targets. Yeah.
Okay. But that's why these projects are so important, and you know, it is so important that people like yourselves and the projects that we're going to see here and what you're doing at Samara are so important, because someone needs to pioneer the methodologies, to share the lessons learned, and to bring the communities with them into what for some farms will appear very high risk. But there are, I think in response to the gentleman's question, I was just saying that there are attempts at legislation, and it was really reassuring for you to say that South African Parks is really committed to trying to attain their global goals, even if Britain is perhaps not doing quite so well.
But you've got the opportunity of real scale. That's the thing, isn't it?
We could go on and on, but I think we're going to. I think the key takeaway is collaboration on everything, and that's what I've taken away from this. Thank you both so much. It's been fascinating. I think Venetia has a few words to say quickly.
And Olly and Isabelle for your time, and Karen, thank you, and the whole team at Thyme. We're so grateful that all of you are able to join us today. I find these talks so inspiring and so important, because it means that we can come together, and we're all kindred spirits here, to learn and deepen our understanding, and hopefully collaborate and have some interesting conversations today. So we are going to see Izzy's project in South Africa in November, so please do come and chat to me or Duncan or Katia and Lara if you'd like to learn more about it. we're going to do a bit of a walk through the meadows now. So those that are joining us, we'll meet in the barn at probably in 10 minutes. So get some mud-friendly shoes on. And we have a few wellies as well there for people that don't have them. And yeah, come to more of these talks. There's an amazing calendar of happenings at times, so please check them out. And I'll see you in the barn in 10 minutes.
How do migrating birds avoid migrating the plants?
Well done. Thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah, but can I come to Shipton and pick up this? Because I've got 2 men at my hand, but if I can sweep by and pick it up, I'll be there about... Okay, I'll find out now. Because there's so many people at the village, so nice. It's always interesting. Do you know what I really want to do? I never have tried.
I have been out there for a few weeks, so it's probably will change.
All the birds are gone.
I'm sure all nesting is being very quiet, so we'll have to come here.
A bit of a shock when we turn up. Lovely work,
I got to get a pair of wellies.
Yes, perfect. Yeah.